Cruzamos ahora el Atlántico y aterrizamos en Nueva York para encontrarnos con George Saffaye. Este estratega de BNY Mellon cree que estamos solo al principio de una gran revolución en la movilidad que cambiará muchos negocios. Por eso tiene su casa totalmente domotizada y en actualización constante. Así que, Alexa, dile a George que inicie su presentación.
Don't say that too loud. She's right behind you on the screen, so she might do something. But thank you. Excited to be here. And yes, mobility innovation is certainly a theme that we are quite excited about. We've been investing in the theme for a little over 2 years now. And quite frankly, we think this is going to be a theme that emerges quite into the next decade. And I do want to point out that, despite the pandemic, I think what the pandemic has done is really not so much change or derail the theme. I think it's actually accelerated a lot of the tailwinds that were behind the theme. So I think we're only seeing it accelerate even faster. So why don't we start really quick with a simple definition, how we define mobility innovation. And it's really centers around the shift of the use, the power, and the control of all means of mobility. And that means not only the vehicle, but anything sort of surrounding the vehicle and the way we interact with the world around us. Because while we may travel from one spot to another, remember, delivery, food delivery, package delivery, trucking, so many things fall into this. But the use, power, and control is important because we want to be able to invest in the entire chain of opportunity. For instance, electric vehicles, investing in the beginning where the lithium is extracted, lithium being the main component of batteries, all the way across the investments to the end, which would be theoretically the recyclers. Remember, it's about having the entire playing field available for us to allocate investments. But let's take a look at the theme itself. What are the catalysts for mobility innovation? And this is, quite frankly, both pre and post COVID-19 and the pandemic. The technology aspect is going to be dramatic. The cloud infrastructure, how cars are going to be massive data gatherers. The mobility that we do is going to generate significant data. That data will get into the cloud. We have these concepts of edge computing and 5G. 5G will probably be the single most transformational technology that we see over the next 5 years, and will build entire businesses that we never had before on this very powerful communications network. And shifting to regulatory. Regulatory is both, looking at how to not only regulate, but make sure they can incorporate and protect and advance how we as a society live. So they're going to address things like urban congestion and the autonomous vehicle readiness, road safety, are all part of this mobility theme. And then shifting towards the environmental aspect, right? The CO2 emissions and quite frankly, the scandal we just went through with some of these automakers, and how we want to get better and much better in terms of the vehicles and quite frankly, the devices we use. We want to address population, and importantly, we need to build out an entirely new grid infrastructure, but a grid infrastructure that leverages more renewables, and importantly, is what we call smart. So a smart grid, meaning an automated management system on basically integrating these new opportunities. And then lastly, the consumer, right? Everything from the auto replacement cycle, which would be quite different than I think we've seen in the past, to demographics, to different demographic segments in terms of where they're growing, such as in Asia. So we couldn't be more excited about the catalysts behind the investment opportunities. If you think about these trends I mentioned that we're accelerating, some of the biggest are centered around connectivity, as I mentioned earlier with the cloud. But when you think about, we have this saying called V2X, and it simply means vehicle to everything. And that's going to be something that you'll hear throughout this presentation about how we are going to embed this connectivity in almost everything we do. Factory automation, in terms of the build of an electric vehicle versus an internal combustion vehicle is quite different and requires less factory or labor around the factory process. So again, opportunities to really reinvent almost entire processes and digital transformation. That is just simply, and it's so important, it's simply basically going from analog to a digital world. And that's what we're in the middle of. The pandemic has accelerated that. And then lastly, innovation beyond passenger cars. I mean, we're looking at every aspect of movement changing, whether it's deliveries, whether it's food or drone deliveries and packages, whether it's trucking and freight, even other elements of rail and even flight, where potentially we can be using new technologies and innovations around that. But this is, again, all-encompassing and why we see these trends accelerating. Now, if we take a step further and look at really what have been the headwinds that we need to address in terms of challenges, we were on a path towards roughly 70% of the world's population basically living in urban areas by 2050. And just for perspective, just as recently as the late 1950s, only about 20% of the world's population was in urban areas. So we're looking at massive urban density as we go further out in time. In addition, we have massive freight that is going to begin to, congest our roads. And importantly, some of the statistics that really strike me as an investor is when you think about all the cars in the world, and if you go to the right side of the presentation, you can see there's about 1.2 billion today, and it should grow to about 2 billion by 2035. But at any given time, 95%, on average, 95% of the world's vehicles are actually parked. And that tells me that there's a massive inefficiency here. And one thing that technology does is it basically really deconstructs and attacks, if you would, all the things we do that are basically inefficient. So we have an opportunity here to reconfigure, recalibrate the way we as a society utilize our mobility and engage in mobility. So let's talk about some of the solutions. Well, when we think about what we can do, we can probably take almost half the vehicles off the road, where we'll need less parking spaces. If we can manage through ride sharing and through other models to be able to optimize how we use vehicles. And I think that's going to be a critical element. But when you think about zero emissions in the major cities, those are going to really dramatically demonstrate just the impact of, again, making this change in mobility. But I think the pandemic actually demonstrated that. Because of the pandemic, we've been relegated to confinement for obviously the last roughly 3 months. But around the world, not just in one location, but if you look at LA's got the cleanest, Los Angeles has the cleanest skies they've seen in years. If you go to New Delhi, you could actually see the Himalayas for the first time in 2 decades. Okay, if you go to Milan, if you go to Venice, I mean, the canals, they say, are clear. Dolphins are beginning to reappear in those canals. This demonstrates that if we do this right, we have tremendous opportunity to, again, impact the environment and improve the way we live. But importantly, I want to point to one statistic that is very daunting. About 1.3 million people die every year in fatalities on the roads. If you look at that bottom left box, we can eliminate approximately 87%, almost 90% of those accidents, those fatalities, by simply incorporating the newer technologies that are already beginning to appear into vehicles. So we couldn't be more excited in having the challenges, but importantly, the ability to address those challenges. And that's what's exciting us. So let's keep going. We have 4 key drivers that we focus on within the mobility innovation portfolio: connectivity, autonomous vehicles, ride sharing, and electrification. Connectivity, I've talked a lot about, and you can see here, there are many elements to it, but 5G is going to be the key differentiator. We as a society are going to be building everything on these new 5G platforms. As we embed sensors into our buildings, into our streets, into our traffic lights. We are going to have an ability for vehicles to interact with that world around us. And that is going to be critical in terms of our moves going forward. Autonomous vehicles will be able to drive on their own, but having that connectivity and that fast connectivity will be that added element that we couldn't be more excited about. Then you move to autonomous vehicles. Now, autonomous vehicles, while not here yet, they are going to be, clearly going to develop over the next several years. But even our steps to get there are going to manifest itself in great investment opportunities. We are going to see safety systems. We are going to see an incredible opportunity for some of the systems we have listed here, all incorporated into autonomous vehicles, but those will benefit cars today. We will start to see these safety systems work their way in. On the ride-sharing side, we have great new, whether it's sharing models, whether it's how we're going to use data, we are going to see entirely new business models that emerge. Rather than buying cars, we might subscribe to cars, and we're already seeing early stages there. But again, rethinking the way we use and interact with our mobility. And then lastly, alternative forms of fuel. All right, electrification is one that stands out. But this portfolio is looking at hydrogen and any other new opportunities that come into the fray. Again, areas for us to allocate across the portfolio and be able to keep it relatively diversified within the mobility theme. I apologize. So let's take the first element of sort of a CASE acronym, connectivity, autonomy, sharing, electrification. We want you to understand it is not grounded in just those four things. Even those four are moving. It's fluid. We're seeing connectivity emerge into cyber because cars are now digital platforms. Autonomy is moving to adaptive, right? How the car will get to know you, how it will be there to protect you, right? Sharing is also moving toward sharing data. And electrification is leading to electrification even beyond the car. So think of things like drone technology. Again, freight. We are going to see electrification get utilized in many different ways. So this gives us as investors opportunities, especially if we can identify this change early on and invest before the market recognizes those opportunities. Let's talk about connectivity going to cyber. Here we have cars and other forms, like I mentioned, that are going to be digital platforms. But for us, it is going to be an entirely new way to enable products and build services. And importantly, security is going to be very, very much at the forefront. Why? Well, because cars can do so much more now that if they are hacked, there's a much more impactful outcome if something should go wrong. So again, we have to make sure that when we look across connectivity, we are looking across every aspect of it to ensure that we can invest across the opportunities that exist. When you think about going from autonomy to adaptive, right? Think about the car adapting to everything we do, the drivers, to the cars around us, obstructions in the road, pedestrians. This is a whole new world for us, and we begin to build out this infrastructure. That, quite frankly, is going to be a road that we have to see. Now, what's important here is that, remember, much of what we are seeing because of the pandemic, the stimulus bills, the ability for the governments to want to institute programs are going to really play well into this theme because a lot of this will tie to these green initiatives, to this connective initiatives, whether it be around, incenting these newer cars to be on the road, electric and non-emitting, but also the infrastructure around those vehicles. So we are setting up for what we think is going to be, again, a great future. Just very quickly, sharing of data is going to be important. I know that, especially in Europe, with the regulations and rules around data, this is certainly going to be something that is probably going to be negotiated in a way, but everything we do every day results in the generation of data. As we utilize these cars and modes of transportation, and because they are based in a digital world, they will generate incredible amounts of data. And again, this is the new lifeblood going forward. Everything we do and what companies can do, whether it's to provide new services to you, new business models, the idea will be to get access to that data and utilize it. And then electrification. We've got incredibly new forms of mobility that exist. We couldn't be more excited about the opportunities here. you look at the whole regional portfolio, you'll see some of the ideas that are there today. But nothing escapes what we will look at. We're keeping our minds very open, and I think we are going to see right before our eyes this transformation take place. So I talked a lot about the theme, and now what I'd like to do is talk a bit about the team and the process. While the theme exists, you must have the correct individuals, the right individuals to really go at this. So the lead portfolio manager on our team is a gentleman named Rob Smith. He's been a technology analyst for over 30 years. He understands digital transformation. He leads the technology efforts on the small and mid-cap team, which I think is where his specialty is. And he really has been at the forefront of getting the team to understand and open their minds to what these opportunities can be. Paired with Rob is a gentleman named Frank Ogan, who's been basically an autos and industrials analyst for his 26-year career. And he's been incredible at understanding sort of the business side, the industrial side of what we're coupling with technology. So having the two of them on the portfolio is, quite frankly, an incredible opportunity for us. And we also have Eric Swords, who's also a technology specialist, but he focuses more on the large scale space. What we do in this portfolio is we want to make sure that we can deliver to our clients an opportunity across the entire cap spectrum and have that focus on the investment team. We have a quantitative portfolio manager in Sean Zhang. He brings almost 15 years of quantitative experience. We leverage quantitative models to help us manage risk in the portfolio, to help us look at companies and universes, and to ensure that the fundamental work is being challenged by the quantitative work we do and the quantitative models, and that gives us the best balance. And of course, you see me, I'm last on the team, but I'm the investment strategist. And my role is embedded in the team. I don't have decision making, and my job is to make sure that those individuals that you saw previously are actually staying at the organization, at the firm, focusing on when managing the portfolio. So I do much of our external focus and external work. We think this is the right approach to have. And I'm going to get through some of these other pages really quick. I know I want to be sensitive to everybody's time. But as you look at what we've built around this investment team, we've got a global equity research team that covers all segments of the economy, all regions of the world, and quite frankly, all areas of the market cap spectrum. This is primarily the large cap, and then we have specialty focus in the small and mid. I think this is very important. I think the one thing we don't want to do is deliver to our investors, a portfolio of stocks that mimics maybe their technology fund or mimics another portfolio they have. I truly think the mobility strategy is investing in differentiated companies and companies that have a very important, if you would, what we call at the firm, a materiality to the theme. And getting that and understanding how material the companies are today, and hopefully getting in well before, again, as I mentioned earlier, the market recognizes just how important they are going to be to the future of mobility. We do organize those same individuals in another way through sort of a thematic lens, if you would. So we kind of take the same individuals as on those previous pages and kind of give them more of a thematic element, so you can kind of see where they will fit. But again, we are really standing behind the thematic work that we do on the research side with, again, a robust platform. The process is very important to us. And quite frankly, it begins with what I mentioned earlier, which is materiality. And materiality is simply a measurement of how material a company is to the theme we're investing in. And we have materiality of low, medium, and high. And we build a universe of companies that must have at least some materiality. So they either have one of those three. And then we begin to sort of, go through that universe and begin to identify the opportunities and which ones are the most exciting to us, which ones have the most upside opportunity at any given point. And then we begin to sort of get very, very comfortable with which of those stocks really will make it onto the candidate list that we want to get into the portfolio. It can range from everything around timing, everything around what's going on within the specific areas of the industries that they're in. But the portfolio all time will reflect what we think are those best opportunities around, especially materiality. It doesn't mean we have a portfolio filled with high materiality stocks. Sometimes the best opportunity is a low materiality stock going to a medium or a high materiality. That's when the market has to reassess the company, must reassess its opportunity. And that's why we want to identify that and get into those stocks as early as possible. Going into the fund itself, here are the top 10 holdings. And you can see here, it's an aggregation, if you would, in our top 10 of different segments, different areas. Software, we have Splunk and Ansys. One specializes in data analytics, which we think is going to be critical. The other does simulation software, which again touches mobility, but also touches 5G and other areas of the market. We're very proud to have these companies at the top of our list. MediaTek is involved in the semiconductors segment of the market. Global Technologies does more the industrial side of things, especially with tolls and digitizing a lot of the roadways. Alphabet's in the portfolio. Again, we don't like to have mega cap stocks in here simply because, again, we differentiated. But hey, they do have a great opportunity in their Waymo division. We think that's a fantastic opportunity as a leader, if you would, in autonomous vehicles, autonomous driving. So that's why it has a prominent place here. And then obviously we have a number of other holdings. But again, if you want, we can certainly talk in terms of questions. We also have the industry breakdown. Clearly, technology is a big part of what we're doing, but we certainly have electronic equipment, auto components, electrical equipment. So we are keeping relatively diversified. And remember, I think the most important thing to remember about what we're doing is around the CASE acronym and how we define it. We have a very, very wide playing field. It's intentional. We want to play entire supply chain. We want to invest in this entire supply chain. And we want to make sure that we have got the right balance of investments in any segment of the market. And then if I can, what I'd like to just quickly talk about is when you look at our portfolio, the one thing that stands out to me on a consensus basis, when you look at the estimates for the companies we own versus the ACME World Mid-Cap, which is what we use as our benchmark, you can see that the portfolio, despite having a higher PE ratio, has a much higher growth rate on consensus estimates. If you actually use our estimates, those estimates would likely be higher by quite a bit. And that's the exciting part of again, what we're investing in and why we find it so intriguing. And then lastly, let me just finish on performance. Going into the pandemic, quite frankly, we have been focused on companies with very strong balance sheets, quite frankly, companies that, again, are playing thematic trends that act as tailwinds, and we think we're going to be very important in what they did. And I think that manifested itself very well in how we were able to hold up, generating, a very, very strong return, and holding up much better than the equity on a year-to-date basis. You can see we had a slight gain versus a decline of 12%. And then going back, obviously, over the trailing year, up 23% versus basically the index being flat. So I think I'm right at my 20 minutes, and I appreciate you hearing me and listening, but I'm happy to take questions.
Gracias, George.
Thank you very much, George. Thank you for that presentation. Let's go to the questions. We do have several already, and there's one. Okay, you can hear us, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfecto.
Yes.
Sí, perfecto.
Well, you were talking about the pandemic and mobility, and there's actually a question that's saying, how will COVID-19 impact your forecasts in this mobility thematic? Because a lot of people won't be traveling to their offices or to the malls anymore. So how do your assumptions change now?
Well, I think that what we are going to see for now is clearly more emphasis on personal vehicle usage. I certainly think that is going to accelerate. And we want to be very careful of selling more internal combustion vehicles and now beginning to think about how we can broaden out the alternative use of obviously electrification. But importantly, we have to realize that a lot of the existing infrastructure and the movement, once we get through this pandemic, once we are hopefully behind us when we start to see resurgences and that begins to fade, we are likely to return to at least some form of again, going back into our offices and communicating and being together. And I think we have to get ready for that aspect as well. And I think that when you think about mass transit, so utilizing whether it's trams or whether you're using trains, clearly there's going to be an emphasis on autonomous technology where you don't have, manned vehicles, manned transport. So getting more of that out, because again, they're the ones that would be most affected by people getting on and off, obviously the trams. But we're going to see, I think what we're going to see is innovation around the design and the usage of a lot of our mobility. I don't know how we can configure it. I think that's something that tends to drive innovation when we encounter something like this. So we're excited to see. But right now, the bigger focus would be on personal vehicles. I think more people are going to utilize vehicles. But we have to get innovative around even the ride sharing. I think you've seen ride sharing usage go down. I don't think people necessarily want to own more cars. It's an appreciating asset. It's not a very good asset, quite frankly. But, we have to be innovative in that perhaps we can line the headliners of vehicles with UV light that can sterilize. There's a lot of things that we can think about. And what I find is these pandemics begin to push you towards those solutions. So our job as investors, the individuals I showed you on those pages, we have got to stay in focus. We have got to focus on where the initiatives are coming into play, and quite frankly, what is real, what can develop, what can we do, because the world is not going to stop, and that's the bottom line.
Hay preguntas también relacionadas.
There's also some questions about the turnover in the portfolio. Is it now higher? Because obviously companies that are very innovative sometimes are overtaken by another innovation and they kind of drop out of the curve. Does that mean that the churn or the rotation is higher in your portfolio than in most?
I would not say it is. I think we expect to have turnover of somewhere between 50 and 70%, and I think we're at about 70% last I checked. I would tell you that we were very comfortable going into the pandemic with the companies that we owned. And we don't own companies for the next quarter or 2 quarters. We really do focus on companies for the next 2 to 3 years. So unless we felt there was a material shift in the company's development or execution trajectory, well, then we would change and begin to perhaps, alter, if you would, that complexion. We were not very excited about many of the automotive manufacturers. We were focusing more on a lot of the component suppliers, especially the ones that had higher levels of what we think are differentiated products. And I think that's been very helpful to us. I think we are playing a lot in the technology space. And what the technology companies are doing is they're leveraging their opportunities, even around this work from home concept, if you would. We're seeing a lot of the, obviously, of the opportunities that the companies have sort of, playing into this work from home. Because we're going to see a lot more develop in terms of what we think are going to be the reshoring of supply chains, the reshoring of a lot of different things. And that's going to get more into factory automation. So we are starting to see some of these shifts develop. But you have to be very, very careful not to react quickly. So for the portfolio to turn over would imply that we are seeing a change and we are making a shift very quickly. But, I think that even the rhetoric around, let's say you want to move the supply chain out of China, bringing it back to the United States might not actually be the best option. You might see that change take place. Perhaps it goes to Vietnam. Perhaps it goes to another country. So we as investors can't react. We need to go through those ideas, go through where these companies are going to basically be spending that capital. Because the capital expenditures are really where companies benefit. If you reshore to the U.S., factory automation becomes critical. We will not be competitive on a labor basis. We're too expensive to manufacture. But if you can bring in significant factory automation on a 5G network, right, that helps to optimize that communication throughout your entire supply chain, where you don't need people with clipboards anymore checking inventory. It's all automated. You now begin to have this advantage. And I want to make one point here. I think it's important. But when you hear governments talking about 5G being a matter of national security, it really is critical. You're going to be building your future economy on a digital platform that is free. So yes, you must be, focused on this, but I do think the opportunities around this are going to be incredible. But you're not going to watch us react to them. I think that's a dangerous game to play.
Josh, tenemos también.
Well, George, we also have a question about privacy, data protection, and so on. I know that in the US that's a concern, and in Europe even more so, I think, because our regulation is so much stricter. How much could that become or to what extent could that be an obstacle? We've seen that how in COVID-19, these tracking or tracing apps have not really been very successful in France, for example, because people didn't saw it as a privacy issue. So how much of an obstacle could that be?
I think it can be, quite frankly, a significant obstacle. And this has always been a very, very challenging topic. And I would tell you why. Because we do value our privacy. Most individuals certainly don't want to overshare. A lot of times we don't realize we're oversharing. But what's important is this, right? The companies that you interact with that actually capture your data, for instance, all of you have generated significant data today from the moment you woke up to the moment you got to this presentation. All right, that data is in the hands of not one company, but many companies. But the idea is that, okay, so they have the data, and under regulations, they can't do much with it in certain ways. But if they could do what they wanted, they can let you have services that are tailored to you. They can find things that are relevant for you. They can suggest and use your data to help, in theory, provide better services for you as well. That's the double-sided coin. That's the double-edged sword, as they say here in the States. And that's a hard one. If you look at the younger demographic, they are much, much freer and willing to share their data. I think as you go higher in the demographic, whether you go to the baby boomers and maybe even the Gen Xers, they're more reluctant. But sharing of data is, again, it's a challenge, because the more data you share, the better things around you can be tailored to you. But you're right, having all that data will also mean that your data is now in the hands of many companies, and they have a profile on you, and they know a lot about you. And you're right, and around the contact trackers and how that would work. There's a saying in the States, and it was always around something called garbage in, garbage out. And if the data itself is somehow manipulated and not really captured in its purest form, then a lot of times your output isn't that good. So again, what you hope is if you're using, and again, leveraging these contact tracers, you need to have this openness of information. But again, I think that that's a very challenging aspect. I don't think a lot of people are willing to share their data and don't share it in a way that is truthful. But the one thing that doesn't lie is when your phone is tracked, because that tells you exactly where you are and where you've been and everything you've done. That's the truth.
Nos estamos quedando.
Well, we're running out of time, George, but I do have a couple more questions, which maybe you can answer really briefly. There's one question we have to ask, and that's about valuations. It's valuations, obviously, we're all watching the trends, but there is some concern about whether valuations are not too high already. In your presentation, you said that, you said that as well, but I wonder if you want to add more details, since there's several questions about valuations.
Yeah. Just really quick on valuation. I think that's a great question. I think it's probably the most important question in some ways. But for us as investors on the mobility innovation team, I want you to understand, we don't actually use valuation up front. That's at the back of the process, and I'll tell you why. What we want to do up front is we want to understand the companies and their unique position, and something that we call is earnings power, right? Earnings power is it's probably a box people check, but they truly don't focus on the ability of the company to generate that earnings. And if you think about a PE valuation, it's simply price over that earnings number. So if price is accelerating and the market's getting excited about a company, and you've got an earnings number that doesn't actually get reported until every quarter, well, then clearly you could see valuations begin to get expensive. And as you go further out in time, it gets expensive. But if you underestimate the earnings power of a company and don't appreciate the earnings power of a company, then what you don't realize is that stock that looked expensive today is actually relatively cheap. And in some instances, very cheap. Because, and I like to use like Amazon as a great example. And I'll never forget when that stock was trading at $300 per share. But if you understood that this was a company revolutionizing, not just an e-commerce company, revolutionizing distribution, revolutionizing logistics, revolutionizing the way we can get product to individuals. Then on top of that, began to model out that little tiny division they had at the time called Amazon Web Services, which wasn't broken out, but it was still a part of their discussions. If you were able to model that out, you would have realized the earnings power of Amazon at that time was almost limitless. And here we are today at $2,700 a share for that stock. And many estimates will tell you it's going at $3,500 or $4,000. That's just an example. Always context the valuation. The biggest problem with evaluation is if the company cannot deliver on earnings. And that's why you need to be that's why you have to have a robust research platform that is very, very deep on the companies and getting an understanding of where that earnings trajectory goes. But again, I'll stop there because I have more to say, but I'll stop.
Well, of course, that's the hardest part, to know where the earnings are going to go and not just stay with a general idea of where the valuations are right now. And well, we're finishing, almost done, but let's have just one more question. Most of your portfolio, the companies are based in the US. That's a market that has been performing really well. But how long can it continue to lead earnings? And could that medium term become a risk to have such high exposure there?
Yeah, so, right now, the reason why there's a predominant U.S. exposure is only because that's really where we're seeing the opportunities. We've done a lot of work and we're doing a lot of work in Asia, especially around China, doing a lot of work in Europe, quite frankly. And again, because if you think about the complexities of investing in the space, it's important to realize that we're seeing a trend develop. And what's interesting is I think a lot of companies now, because we can get to not only factory automation is revolutionizing things, but if you think about it, a lot of companies are now thinking of manufacturing local. So now we have to think about, again, how they're going to invest rather than building a plant in one country and shipping all over the world. We're now able to optimize where we can manufacture. And there's some elements of that are quite exciting. But the opportunity for these companies right now has been predominantly in the U.S. As we see more develop in China, and we did have at one point a much higher China exposure, but China's going through a market that has a significant number of EV manufacturers right now. And that has to consolidate, and that's actually a bigger risk to us. So we're kind of staying away from that aspect. And we're trying to move forward, again, more the suppliers. We're pretty excited about our exposures in not only the U.S., but also in Europe. And we're going to continue to do more work there. And I think you're going to start to see, again, as we see better opportunities, the portfolio will shift towards those better opportunities.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, George, for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I could spend another 20 minutes because it's such a fascinating topic.
So many more things I'd love to talk to you about. There are some very interesting things taking place.
Muchísimas gracias.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, George.